On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Eddie Flaisler. He's the head of products engineering at Lob. We're going to be talking about engineering strategy for frontline managers. Eddie's got a great background and some great examples to walk us through. We're going to talk about, what are frontline managers? What do they do? How do you delegate strategy for them to go execute and be successful? Because ultimately, their success is your success. Eddie, thanks for being on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Awesome. I think it's going to be an interesting topic, useful to a lot of engineering leaders listening or people who will eventually be a frontline manager. Let's start off at the top. Obviously, frontline manager could mean different things. What does that mean in this context to you?
Sure. So, I see the role of an engineering manager, or as we say, EM, as a constrained optimization problem. So you need to maximize the quantity and quality of what your people deliver. I will assume we can all agree that, a frontline manager manages a team of engineers, but that dry definition is not the point here. So as I said, you're maximizing the quantity and quality of what your people deliver. You need to minimize attrition of performing individuals, and you need to do all that under a bunch of constraint types. So the first constraint is that your team is always spread too thin. It's very difficult to get the right ratio of engineers to engineering work. And companies trying to stay default alive will typically err on the conservative side and understaff you. So there's never enough people. Number two is that, I always say that there are many fine schools for how to be an engineer, but almost none for how to be an employee. It's difficult to teach ownership, teamwork, a healthy sense of urgency, stress management, interpersonal communication. And this has become especially evident when companies switch to remote first. Making people who just see each other on Zoom work effectively together and feel like they're part of something is a super hard problem. So that's also something that a frontline manager does. Lastly, everyone wants to work on what's shiny. That is very true in engineering, but that is not always what the business needs. So being able to communicate that effectively, being able to bring people together and keep them motivated, even though they may not be working exactly on what they want, that is the third and probably one of the most critical parts of what an EM is.
Absolutely. Yes, I think a lot of those will, we'll be talking about different aspects of how someone is successful in the role. And I guess that maybe the word success, I guess, when you want to, maybe we could touch on that, because obviously a frontline manager is responsible for a team, that engineering manager is responsible for delivery. Success is, sometimes not as black and white, right? I mean, obviously, if you're not shipping appropriate levels of product at certain times and whatnot, I guess those are easy barometers of, is this person succeed? But it's always not the case. So I guess when you're looking at engineering managers, those frontline managers, and you're like, well, I need to evaluate, success. I mean, what is that? What should that look like?
Sure. So, I mentioned this optimization problem, and I think that a common perception of the frontline manager's role is that they're mostly there to run the day-to-day, setting the tone on code and design reviews, unblocking dependencies, supporting the growth of individuals on the team, stuff like that. Now, this isn't incorrect per se. That's also part of the work. But in my mind, it represents a huge missed opportunity. Think about it. These managers have the most context and a scope that is narrow enough for them to make the smartest, most informed decisions about the domain they're responsible for. Yet somehow we tend to associate strategy and critical decisions with executives. That's something the big boss should be doing. So when I talk about success, at least at Lob, we try to do the opposite. We want managers to own developing their domain, basically making sure that their domain is delivering strong business value and is a healthy place to work in. It's a place that attracts talent. So we want managers to develop the strategy for their respective domain. And my job is to help them with two things. Number one, as the person with a more business context, I make sure they're working on the right problem. And two, I help them with some of the more, let's say, complex situations they encounter in their team while trying to solve this delivery retention problem I described. And my help hopefully gives them more bandwidth to think about next steps for their domain rather than drowning in the here and now.
Absolutely. I mean, when you're looking at that, obviously delivering high business value, that's critical. There's also, you mentioned retention, growth, all these various factors. But I guess before that, your boss, yourself, you're involved in strategy that the company is looking at, determining those high priority business values that the company wants to go towards. And obviously the engineering manager has to deliver towards that, but they're not necessarily always involved in higher up decisions. When you're conveying those strategies that they're ultimately responsible for, how do you make sure that they're bought in? How do you make sure that they are also seeing that value? Because obviously that's going to be part of what drives their team.
Sure. So I guess the thing that is most important to say is that I am not conveying the strategy. I am conveying the problem statement. There are certain things I need to do to make sure they're equipped to handle the problem statement. We can get to that. But at the end of the day, when we talk about strategy, we should probably say something about mission and vision, because in a way, strategy is the answer to the question posed by these two concepts. Now, to be clear, not every organic engineering team can have a mission. I know people will cringe hearing this, but in practice, when we distribute people between managers, the reason isn't always that we have this beautiful, perfectly defined problem statement to give them. It can be a matter of span of control. You add managers so that engineers get enough attention. It can be that you bring together a certain skill set to address a wide variety of ad hoc, not necessarily related problems. A mission isn't always easy to define. What can and should be expected of any engineering team is to have a vision for the technology and or business problem that they're solving. I'm not telling them what their vision is. I am asking them, where do you want to be in X months? Note that I said months, not years. The time horizon for the decisions of a frontline manager is naturally shorter. So answering questions like, do you want to platformize something? Do you want to deprecate something? Maybe make the need for this whole team redundant, the team as a concept, so you and your people can focus on more interesting problems. When you know where you need to go, that's when we can start talking about strategy, which we can go into details about what strategy looks like. But I hope this answers your question.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, obviously, where do you want to go? That to me, like you mentioned, you can't decide. You can decide you want to go on a vacation, but we can't do any of the planning unless you pick a location or pick some characteristics. Otherwise, there's no strategy to get there. And just for the team, what are they trying to accomplish? Where they're trying to go? I guess out of curiosity, when you're hearing some of those problems they're wanting to tackle, some of those different initiatives, prioritizing those, obviously is important. How do you work with a frontline manager to help prioritize some of what they're trying to accomplish?
Yes. So I think one thing that is very, there's that famous book, Wartime CEO, Peacetime CEO, right? I believe that's the name. Every team, with respect to what they're trying to achieve, has a different set of inherent business priorities, but also a set of constraints. What are those constraints? What situation is your team in, and what do we do to keep it healthy? I'll give you a kind of a tactical example that helps clarify what I'm saying. A few companies ago, I was in a situation where we had a strong business opportunity that was contingent on our ability to deliver something major to the customer within a few months. We had a serious underperformance problem in the team that would have been a natural owner for this. So in a way, you would say the priority for the team right now is to deliver. And since we have underperformers, we need to do something. We were managing it, but it was obvious that if we wanted to take that huge business opportunity, we would have to expedite the process of replacing the weaker performers for the team. That doesn't work like that. So when we sit and discuss what actions do we need to take and in what order of priority, we need to think of what is the impact of each step was going to take. So if you think of that situation, the stock was doing terrible. We had some organizational changes at the top, and there was this general sense of instability. So we knew that it was the wrong time to support the creation of a narrative that we're doing silent layoffs, so that it's time for our strong performers to look for another job. We couldn't afford, our priority was to say, okay, let's act on performance management. But that's not true. That is not the thing we need to do right now because there is a risk involved. So the solution ended up being less straightforward. We negotiated an MVP for a smaller amount of money, had a small contractor team build it while adhering to the kind of standards that would allow our in-house to easily take over the development. And when the atmosphere stabilized, we did replace team members and transitioned ownership of the software back to the relevant team. So I guess the point I was trying to make is that instead of just saying, oh, we just choose the most important thing, we choose the most important thing given the constraints we have, because it's never just about the business. It's also about how do we keep the team meant to deliver these business results healthy.
That's a good example. I guess one thing that maybe a follow up to that is, the manager obviously wants to deliver, what they feel is going to be the biggest impact, right? They feel like, hey, these are the priorities I need to work on, but they're also dealing with day-to-day tactical challenges with the team, mapping that, that strategy they've built for their own team versus that, the tactical issues that come up, staying on track. That could be an easy challenge. Like not to say getting distracted, but staying on track, it could be a challenge. How do you help? How do you kind of help a frontline manager balance that? Hey, I've got to deal with the day-to-day, noise, issues, whatever that is, but I still need to kind of keep the ship on a fairly, linear trajectory so that we're not all over the map.
Yes, it's interesting you asked that because this is something that you see not only with frontline managers, you also see that with directors and you see that with VPs. I think we've all worked in environments as people in engineering where you see someone who's like titled, I don't know, VP product, but they're also director of product, manager of product, and intern of product. Like you have this title, but you end up doing all the work and nothing gets done. So I think part of my responsibility is to help given the financial constraints, of course, with organizational design. Just because you're the manager of the team, I want you to be competent, right? I don't want you to be the type of manager who just needs to delegate everything. But that doesn't mean you need to do absolutely everything. You have a product partner. You have a scrum master you can appoint. We like to appoint scrum masters on a rotating basis so people get an opportunity to understand what it means to run the day-to-day of the team. You appoint tech leads, right, to do more hand-holding for the more junior members and maybe lead the design, depends on how you want to structure it. Like I know I've worked with teams where everyone does kind of their own thing. Project management, maybe there's a technical program manager. At Rob, we don't have TPMs, but I am a sucker for spreadsheets, so I help a lot with project management. At the end of the day, I think when I think of the role of an engineering manager, I don't have a checklist. I know what outcomes they need to achieve. There are, of course, some aspects to the how, which will come up as I'm thinking of the person's performance, but I am thinking of the outcomes of the team. And to that end, everything is fair game. So we need to solve the problem. The fact this person is working days and nights to do the work of 5 people doesn't impress me. I want to make sure we're setting them up for success. And my way of doing it is making sure that all the roles that need to be in place are distributed between people so the manager can actually focus on running the team as opposed to, as I said earlier, drowning in the here and now.
Yeah, I mean, that's, I think kind of what I'm hearing when you're talking about, delegating some activities to Scrum Master, for instance. I mean, obviously delegation is tricky. I think that's one of the hardest parts of any managers, knowing not only what to delegate, how to delegate, when to delegate. And I guess a frontline manager is kind of caught between, obviously they have, managers, a management layer they're reporting to, there's delegation down to them. Obviously they need to delegate down to specific people, like you said, to make sure that there's productivity and no one's working 5 people's worth of jobs. Once we're talking about delegation, that becomes a little bit more. I mean, all this is a lot of art, but that's even more art than what we've been talking about, because that's reading things, understanding dynamics. When you talk about delegation, can you maybe give us a little insight in terms of when you're talking about EM, what you'd be hoping, in terms of delegating, how they manage that process?
Sure. Delegation doesn't start when you delegate. It starts when you build your own team and when you identify the different personas or the different levels of engineering maturity that you have in your team. I always say that I understand that people have different scope, but to me, everyone in a team is a leader. So, for example, in teams I manage, it's very rare. There needs to be very special circumstances for me to say there is one tech lead for the team and they just call the shots. I just don't believe in organizing the team like that. In a team, we have multiple work streams that are running in parallel. And I would say every person, or like not every person, because not everyone you can't have too many cooks in the kitchen, but let's say your team is X people and you divide them between Y work streams. Every work stream will have a tech lead. And that tech lead can be as junior as an intern. What changes is the scope. I am expecting a certain level of ownership and leadership. So, when people come to me and say, this person is just an engineer 1 or engineer 2 or call whatever you want, they can't orchestrate the work, I don't buy it. I'm sorry. We work with them, we coach, but there's a certain level of maturity not about engineering, but about approaching work. You have a very well-defined, very narrow problem statement, but now you need to you need to break down the tasks. And if you're not sure how to, you need to ask the questions. You need to understand how to resolve dependencies, how to unblock yourself, how to ask for help. Why it seems that I'm going on tangents from what you asked, but not really, because when a manager makes sure that is the type of behavior that exists in their team, delegation boils down to, hey, can you own this? Done. The complexity you're describing, I agree that people see when we talk about kind of the art of delegation, not to oversimplify, a lot of times comes from the fact that, I don't know, like this, I give this person a task and he or she doesn't even complete it. So how can I delegate more responsibility to them? So I think the moment the core strengths are maintained in the team in terms of leadership, in terms of work ownership on a regular basis, delegation is simpler. Now, there are, of course, tactics, right? I'm not going to ignore that. There are things around leadership by example. So I always encourage managers, and I try to do that myself, to kickstart the tasks themselves with a person or to show what the output would look like. And also, probably the most important thing is to be cognizant of their own, every person has their own, I don't know if you want to call it biases or personality traits when it comes to delegation. Like I always have this imposter syndrome that I feel that if I'm not going to do everything myself, I'm actually a fraud and I don't know why Lob is paying me. So when I need to make a very conscious decision to delegate, because my instinct is just to do everything on my own, and that's not sustainable, right? Other people just have this thing that they're very gifted leaders, but when they need to give some work to other people, they don't trust them. So maybe you need to work on trusting relationships. All that, bunch of words to say that delegation is the end. Everything that needs to happen is towards being able to delegate, building trusting relationships, staffing your teams accordingly, working on yourself. Once that is in place, I believe that the actual action is trivial.
I like that a lot. I like that delegations. It is almost the end product. And I think something you mentioned about resolving dependencies, made me start thinking about when we delegate just tasks in general, whether it's engineering or not. We tell somebody, hey, I need you to do this. A lot of times the obstacle is they just don't know where to start, because that's all in your head. You understand some of the dependencies, where those tentacles go, so that you can understand how to start breaking it down. And when we ask somebody else to step in without that context, without that understanding, I don't want to say that we're setting them up to fail, but they need to be, to your point, much more experienced to be able to start inferring and drawing on what some of those things could be. And even then, they still might, resolve the wrong dependencies and solve, the wrong problem based on what you asked to delegate.
Totally. Yes. And I think, I don't expect people to have answers. I expect people to have questions. It's really interesting because the list of questions you just brought up, like the things that a person potentially doesn't know, that is the extent of my expectation when working with anyone I delegate a problem to. I don't need them to know everything. I need them to be able to say, I want to know what the dependencies are. I want to know what I don't know. I want to know, if I'm supposed to give a timeline, are there any components of this software that I'm not thinking about that may need to be changed? If you're asking me to put a process in place, how do we define that? Is just a documentation, or meeting with people, meeting with teams and trying to get their buy-in? What is the scope of the work I'm doing? So over time, you teach how to ask the right questions. But one thing that I really like about questions that pertain to managing any project is that it is a finite list. So at some point, the high-level questions repeat themselves. So I can see pretty quick growth in terms of people's ability to ask the right questions.
Absolutely. Eddie, this is a fantastic conversation. I think, I'm not managing frontline managers, but I'm going to take away, for me personally, you mentioned resolving dependencies. Sometimes I think about my child when I'm like, I need you to do something. And the first reaction is, I don't know. And now I'm starting to put myself in the shoes of her issues, and it's like, well, she probably just doesn't know where to start, or what she needs to do to break down the problem. And maybe I need to do a better job, as her quote unquote manager, her parent, and provide some context and ask her, what is it you don't know before you go try to do this, so that I can help her, bring those questions, versus her first reaction is, well, I don't know, and you get frustrated. And I think, obviously, that's a simplistic analogy, but I think people, when they get a task, when they know what to do, they feel confident, they go tackle it. When it's something a little bit outside their scope, it's really what you said is, what questions they should be asking? And sometimes when it's new, you don't know what questions. And I think sometimes people, we can help people kind of get there. So amazing insights.
I do want to, if you don't mind, add something to this. I think it's a very natural, God knows it's mine as well, but I think it's a very natural response from a manager trying to help their reports kickstart something, to do this by example, right? Here's how I would do it. Believe it or not, I actually learned that doesn't work, because just because your mental model of solving a problem a certain way works, doesn't mean someone else will be able to kind of fathom, why are you thinking about the problem this way? Why are you communicating it this way? So they may end up even getting more confused, trying to mimic you as opposed to doing their own thing. So one thing that I found very useful is to say, take a stab at it. Ask me the question, take a stab at it. But then here's the responsibility of the manager. You need to be very, very empathetic and compassionate when they come with the first iteration. Because if they didn't know how to start, and you told them, just do something, the worst thing you can do to a trusting relationship with a report, being if that's a manager or an IC, is to say, no, this is garbage. That's not what I meant. Because that shadows trust. If you told them, do your thing, it's going to be fine, stick to it. Accept the fact that it may be completely off from what you wanted, and then you can iterate together, because what's important is to get them started.
So I guess, one thing that we haven't touched on is, delegation of strategy, right? So are there any specifics to delegating strategy or how you would approach that?
Yeah, so that part is easy. I just say, that problem statement we're having, it's your problem now. No, I'm just kidding. That only makes me laugh. In all seriousness, though, the challenging part is not the delegation of strategy, but how I make sure they are actually set up for success in coming up with a strategy and solving the problem. And for that, I always say there are four things that need to be true. The first one is clear scope of ownership. Think about it. If delineation between who owns what and who can help with what thing isn't clear, the dependency management becomes a nightmare. And people are unmotivated to solve big problems because they end up burning on logistics and communication overhead as opposed to the actual solution. The second one is kind of related, especially when it comes to managers, a solid decision-making model in the organization. I'm going to get a lot of pushback for this, but as important as getting buy-in is, I find that buy-in is often abused when org leaders don't feel like bothering with creating a clear model of who owns what decision and instead put it on their people to get consensus. Not having a predefined decision maker creates so much friction. At Uber, we had many values I appreciated, but one I really didn't. Best idea wins. It sounds very inspiring, but it doesn't scale. It's humans we're dealing with. We all want to make an impact, have our names on shiny things, and most importantly, feel heard. So if there's no framework that identifies who eventually makes the decision and what is the etiquette of contributing input to the decision, it becomes a zero-sum game. The third one that is surprisingly common to not see, and needs to be there to delegate effectively, is, how should I put it? Lifespan of directional decisions. Everyone knows about Twain's quote. What do you call it? If you don't like the weather in New England now, just wait a few minutes, right? You may or may not be surprised at how lightly people take making directional changes. It can be constant reorgs. It can be repeatedly pivoting to another work stream without completing the previous one. If people know that chances are they will not get to see their plan through, they're not motivated to make one, let alone a good one, right? So I always think of Mark Twain's quote, in the sense that we tend to, change things very lightly, but that demotivates people from thinking long term. Absolutely last thing is clarity about constraints. One thing, speaking of, we were talking about giving context to people. People love to say sky is the limit. Sky isn't the limit because you have to work with the constraints you have. So, for example, I mentioned organizational design. Every engineering leader I know has read team topologies, and everyone wants to do the science of organizational design, and it's going to be so cool and so awesome. Money. What if you cannot afford to hire all these managers? What if you cannot afford to hire all these roles? You need to think outside the box. And I think it's the job of the more senior leadership to provide the context to the manager instead of the person, it's a human being. Instead of getting all excited and I made this huge plan in place, and then you say, sorry, I'm going to clip your wings. Actually, that's not possible. Nothing is more demotivating. You stay in advance. This is the problem you need to solve. Here are the constraints. Here's what's possible. Here's what's not possible.
Awesome. Great insights, Eddie. I was going to ask you a question I like to ask everyone. And this could be a selfish question of what you want or something you think that could help others is, if there's a question or a topic that you could ask a future guest to answer, what would you like for them to cover?
One thing that I've been always very curious about, and I kind of touched on it today, is finding I call it the resourcing sweet spot. I think one thing I noticed in my time working in engineering is that you either have too many people or you have too few people. Normally it's too few, but I've seen both. And, there's a lot of science in the world of optimization and in the world of resource management and how do you do like what's that term? When you do resource planning, right? In the world of resource planning and operations management, there's a lot of science on how to match these numbers, right? How to analyze the work, analyze the vision, analyze what you have coming up, and understand what is the right number of people to have. Yet somehow in tech, I don't see that being applied, right? You either see those starving organizations where everyone's drowning, or you see organizations that are obsessed with growth and hiring and just adding more talented engineers. And then it ends up being this zero-sum game because everyone wants to work on something important and get promoted, but it's not actually needed, right? So just trying to optimize is something that I've always been curious about. And I don't think I've encountered any good working example of balancing that. So I would love to hear more from people who have been successful.
Awesome. Great question. I think that topic would help a lot of people. If someone wants to contact you to discuss anything you mentioned or anything you talked about on the podcast, what's a good way of getting a hold of you?
So first of all, I am always available on LinkedIn. I respond to messages. I'm a social media junkie. So by all means, add me on LinkedIn, send me questions. Please don't try to sell me stuff. I am so tired. I think I get 5 messages a day, 6 messages. That's probably not a lot, but ask me anything you want. I would love to answer. So I think LinkedIn is the best way to reach out to me.
Awesome. We'll make sure, obviously, to include your LinkedIn profile on the show notes. I want to thank you for spending the time sharing. It's a great topic, and I'm excited for people to listen.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. That's it for this episode. We'll be back again, different guest, different topic. Until then, I'll ask for 2 things. One, if you found the podcast useful, share it with somebody you know. I appreciate that. Secondly, if you know someone that can talk about how to optimize for team size, I think Eddie made a great point. Sometimes it's too many, too few. Getting that right balance is critical. I'd love to have you on to talk about that or similar topic. I think there's a lot of value in that question. Otherwise, that's it for this episode. And thank you and goodbye.